Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast Radio.
Welcome back to Southeast Radio's Business Matters with me, Karl Fitzpatrick. Well, with the repercussions of the tracker mortgage scandal still being felt by many customers across Ireland, public confidence in Irish banks is questionable at best. However, one organisation, the Irish Banking Culture Board, has been established with a view to building consumer trust and confidence in these very institutions. Marion, what is the Irish Banking Culture Board?
So, Karl, the Irish Banking Culture Board was set up formally in April of this year. What it is it's an industry initiative founded by the 5 retail banks in Ireland, AIB, Bank of Ireland, KBC, Ulster Bank and Permanent TSB. It was set up really to try and look at what cultural change needs to happen within the Irish banking sector from the perspective of the customers and stakeholders of banks and also from the staff who work in those banks. There has been a devastating loss of trust in the banking sector as a result of very poor behaviour in the sector during the financial crisis and since, and most recently with the tracker mortgage issue. And I suppose the sense is that something really needs to happen to show people that banks are serious about cultural change. There's been a lot of talk, but what we need to see is action. So the 5 retail banks came together. There also was consultation with the Minister of Finance in terms of what could be done to show people that banks were serious about cultural change. And all of that has resulted in the establishment of the Banking Culture Board.
Now, as you say, it was brought about as a result of bad behaviour. But what is the root cause of the bad behaviour, in your opinion?
I think there's a whole series of causes, Karl. I think part of it is how staff felt within the banks themselves, so maybe a sense of not being comfortable to highlight issues that they felt were going wrong. I also think that there was a lack of empowerment of staff to make decisions locally and things were going up to head office, for example. But I also think that, there was probably a lack of thinking through of the end impact of decisions within banks on the end customer. So how was a decision that was being made in head office in relation to, for example, an arrears issue actually going to impact somebody in their day-to-day lives? And when we've been talking about this with bank staff and with banks, it's very clear that the vast majority of people want to do the right thing by their customers, but for whatever reason, that got lost in some of the actions that happened over the years. So that's part of what we're very focused on, is fair customer outcomes for all customers, and that staff are supported in their efforts to do the right thing by customers.
I know that the decision making has changed from the local branch to HQ in Dublin, but now we're seeing machines making decisions. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, and this actually came up as a key issue during the public consultation exercise that we did, which I just might touch on briefly if I can. So during the establishment phase, and we were trying to see what could we actually do that would make a difference, we decided to actually talk to those cohorts of people most impacted by bank culture. So that's the customers clearly and wider stakeholders and the staff. So we did a public consultation exercise where we spoke with a whole range of different bodies and representative bodies about what they felt needed to change. And this issue that you've just mentioned came up very strongly from the SME sector and from the farming sector, that when they were looking to make applications for loans, for example, that they were invariably now being directed to online applications as opposed to meeting somebody face-to-face, and that was causing an issue for many people. So that's something that we have front and centre in our programme of work for the coming year, is to look at that. How can we make sure that artificial intelligence is being used for the good of the customer, and taking away the human interface doesn't have a negative impact on people's interaction with the bank, that they can get a fair hearing and that they can give the best possible case in order to get a loan approved, for example.
Now, you said as part of your consultation phase, you discussed the issues with both the staff and the customers, but what about the Financial Regulator? What level of consultation did you have with them?
Yeah, the Financial Regulator was another key stakeholder for us, so we would have met with them, spoken to them, and we have regular ongoing meetings with the Central Bank. You may be aware that the Central Bank has a remit in terms of behaviour and cultural reviews within the various different banks, so we keep in close contact with them to understand what issues they're seeing, and also we share things from our side. So we have a very close working relationship with the Central Bank.
In the boom, many will say that the financial regulator and the central bank were asleep at the wheel, and in some respects, very, very light touch regulation was imposed on banking in general. What are your thoughts on that, and has that improved in recent years?
I think there's been a lot of debate about that, and there was a very different type of regulatory model back during the financial crisis. Certainly what we see now is the central bank is a very strong regulator. For example, they have done a series of behaviour and cultural reviews within the banks, which is something very new in an Irish context, so moving away from just purely prudential supervision to actually look at behaviour and conduct and the culture of the institutions. They continue to do that and have a very strong role in that sense. So I think the change in their approach is huge since the financial crisis.
It's welcome to see an approach on behaviour and conduct, but what are the consequences if they're being breached?
Oh, well, the central bank has very strong powers to fine and sanction. I think that has been recently played out with the various different fines that have started to come out now from the central bank in relation to various parts of their reviews on trackers, etc. So they have a very strong suite of tools that they can use. Our approach is different. So we're not a regulator. We can't fine or sanction. And that's why we work very closely with the regulator and with other bodies to make sure that we all have a key role to play in cultural change. Our role really is to work with the industry and with the stakeholders of the industry to come up with ideas and practical actions that will make a difference for customers of banks and stakeholders of banks. They see this as more than just words, but there's actually actions behind it.
Now, of course, the Irish Banking Culture Board has been brought about by 5 banks. So on that basis, how are you going to ensure that it remains independent of the banks?
Yeah, and I know this is something that has come up a lot and people are wondering how we can be independent. So there's 2 answers to that. First of all, the way that we have established ourselves. So we went out to a huge number of different bodies through our public and stakeholder consultation and asked them who do they think should be represented on the Irish Banking Culture Board, how should it be structured, what it should do, etc. And our board that we have established, it's a 14-member board. The majority of the members are non-bank, and there's a number of players there who'd be very well known in terms of strong advocates for the customer and the consumer within Irish society, such as Pora Kassan, such as Angela Black, who's the CEO of MABS and the Citizens Information Bureau. So the balance we have on our board will ensure independence, but really I suppose the test will be from the public and stakeholders in terms of the actions that we do, and I hope that people will see through our actions that we are independent and we're not just a voice box for the banks. That's absolutely not what we are about. We're about working with the industry and working with stakeholders to bring about practical changes that will help people to see that there really is a change in the approach of the banks.
Now, one of the issues with terms like behaviour and conduct and morals is they're very subjective terms. But in terms of tangible goals and outcomes, what are you hoping to achieve through the IBCB over the coming years?
Well, what we've done is we've set out our Year 1 work programme, and that has been based off what we heard through the public and stakeholder consultation exercise that I mentioned, and also a very wide-ranging survey of bank staff of over 25,000 bank staff that we did in advance of establishment. So coming out of those 2 pieces of work, we have identified 9 key priorities for us in the coming year. And they're very practical, I suppose, pragmatic actions that we think will make a difference to people. So maybe just to give you a flavour of that, one of the things that we would have heard very strongly from customer groups was about respectful and transparent communications, particularly for people who are in arrears, and also a need for a greater level of care and service to customers who are in a vulnerable position, for whatever reason that might be. So those 2 areas are something that we're working very closely on, looking to see how we can make it easier for people to communicate with their banks, that they understand where they need to go to get information, and that also banks are held to account and make things clear and transparent and fair in terms of their communications. One of the initiatives that came out of that the consultation was in relation to bereaved customers. And that is something that of our 5 member banks, they would be dealing with over 50,000 families of bereaved customers each year. And what we heard loud and clear through the public consultation was this was something when somebody passes away, particularly if it's a very sudden death, that this can cause a huge amount of anxiety and distress to people in relation to the banking services over and above clearly clearly the personal impact and the grief impact on a family. There is a concern about what will happen in terms of bank accounts that might have been in the name of the person who has passed away. So what we did was we brought the 5 banks together to look at this and try and see how we can make this an easier process for what is already a very difficult time for people. And we came out with what we've called a common commitment of care for bereaved customers. So all 5 banks have signed up to that. People can find further details on our website, irishbankingcultureboard.ie. And the common commitment of care is around dedicated phone lines in each of the member banks so people can get through to a number and they will talk to a specialist in relation to the bereaved services that particular bank provides. That they will provide them with information about how they can access available funds in the account, for example, and also how to cover funeral costs. And I think this is a prime example of some very practical actions that we're looking to take.
Now, sales targets, of course, were synonymous with the banking sector in the boom years. What is being done now to restrict that type of pressure within the banking structure?
Well, that's something that would have come out in relation to the results of the staff survey, which we conducted, that there are strong levels of staff stress for various different reasons across our 5 member banks. Some of that may perhaps be sales pressure and some of it may be other issues like changes in the banking model. And we are holding a whole series of sessions directly with staff to explore these issues further. What I would say, though, in terms of cultural change, something that we would be very focused on is the performance model within banks. It's not acceptable that performance is just assessed on financial performance and meeting sales targets, for example. It needs to be a much more balanced approach, taking into account the actual behaviour that people have demonstrated in reaching those, for example, sales targets. Has it been ethical? Have they treated customers fairly? Have they acted always in the best interest of the particular customer? And all of those criteria are really, really important in having a performance assessment and not just assessing people on financial performance.
And what would you say to people that might say that's just pure window dressing?
Absolutely, I understand why people think that, and there is a lot of cynicism out there about what we're doing. I suppose the proof will be in the pudding. We have 9 different priorities that we've set ourselves. We're working very hard on them, and we do hope that people will gradually see that this is making a difference in combination with what the banks are doing themselves and in combination with what the central bank is demanding that they do through their regulatory and supervisory work. This is not going to change overnight, and it's going to take a long time to convince people that the banks are serious about cultural change. But we're hopeful, and we think that we've got off to a good start, and we will continue to engage with the public and with various different stakeholders to get their feedback to see have things changed or what else might we focus on in order to bring about cultural change for the good of the customer.
We know from many media reports over the past 12 or 13 years that people working in banks were fearful of speaking out when they saw wrongdoing. So what type of whistleblower policies are being put in place as a result of this?
Yes, that is an issue. In the staff survey that we conducted in advance of establishment, we specifically asked questions in relation to speaking up. So how comfortable do people feel speaking up? Do they feel supported in the process and so on? And the feedback and the results were somewhat concerning. So of the staff that we surveyed, over 1/3 said they had wanted to raise a concern at work over the past 12 months, but a significant majority of those said that they hadn't raised the concern because they felt that it might be held against them, whether that was in promotion, etc., or they had a concern that actually nothing would happen, that it would be a futile exercise. So this is another one of the priorities within our work programme for the coming year, is really looking at this issue. How can we ensure that staff feel supported if they want to speak up, that it's the right thing to do, and not even at the very extreme end of speaking up where there's something materially wrong. This should be part of the DNA of the institution, that people at all levels feel that they can have alternative views, that they can identify things that they think could work better or things that they think are going wrong, and that they feel comfortable that that is not going to have any personal consequences for them.
And Marion, what power does the Irish Banking Culture Board possess to drive change within the industry?
Our approach is that we are working with the industry and we're working with stakeholders to bring about change. And where we see things that need to change, or we see things that we don't feel are appropriate, we will talk about them and we will highlight them, and we will demand that our member banks address those issues. We will also praise where praise is merited, but what we will try and do is always to be a trusted, independent voice, highlighting what needs to change for the good of the customer.
So for business owners listening to this morning's show, especially SME business owners, what change will they see in the approach that they're getting from their banks over the coming years?
Well, through our work, what we're focusing on is SMEs and farmers, and particularly at the smaller end of that, so probably micro enterprises, people who, enterprises that employ less than 10 or indeed less than 5 people in Ireland. And what we're looking at there, in conjunction with the various different banks who have dedicated programs in this space already, is what can we do to improve that relationship and restore trust in the sector between those types of customers and their banks. A lot of it will be to make sure that there's sufficient means to have face-to-face conversations, that there will be, for example, support in financial awareness and education. This is something that has come out quite strongly. So supporting SMEs and farmers to make sure that they're aware of how to get the best possible result from a loan application, for example. Helping them with their business plans, their applications, highlighting how the actual process works, and also listening, opening up a dialogue, that there is an opportunity for people to raise their concerns. 2 of the members of our board, one of them is Martin Stapleton, who's from the IFA, and we also have Sue O'Neill, who's the chairperson of the Small Firms Association, sitting on our board. So they have a very strong voice for the sector around the table, and the banks are listening to those voices, and they will be informing what we're actually going to be focusing on.
But finally, Marion, if the central bank and the financial regulator were doing their job properly, would there be a need for the Irish Banking Culture Board?
I think there's always a need for a collective industry approach to this issue. As I've said throughout, I think the central bank's approach is very different to what we're about. We are an industry body working with stakeholders, exchanging information, cooperating together to try and see what we can do to make a difference to customers and staff of banks. The regulator's role is very, very different. They have a supervisory approach with a whole arsenal to fine and sanction, and that's not what we're about. So I think there's always space for different voices. There's a lot that needs to happen in terms of cultural change, and we want to be one of the strong voices in advocating for that change.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Marion Kelly, the acting CEO of the Irish Banking Culture Board, and I would like to thank Marion for sharing her insights with us this morning.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
South